The sound of the door slamming behind me echoed through the small apartment, vibrating against my chest like a warning drum. I had spent months tiptoeing around him, memorizing which words would set him off and which ones would pass unnoticed. But tonight, I had slipped. It had started as a simple disagreement, something small, almost insignificant, but it had snowballed in the way it always did. His voice, sharp and icy, cut through the room as he accused me of laziness, of disrespect, of daring to have opinions that didn't match his own. I tried to explain, to reason, but it was like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. And then it happened. The sting of his hand across my cheek left a heat that wasn't just physical but humiliating, a mix of fear and anger coursing through me all at once. "You're going to Russia. Don't call or come over. We're done," he spat, each word a blade twisting deeper. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and I could feel the walls of my own home collapsing around me, turning familiar spaces into a cage I no longer recognized. For a moment, I said nothing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sudden rupture in a life I had once believed was stable. He had always been a storm in our home, unpredictable and sharp-tongued, but this felt final. I could hear my mother in the next room, silent, unmoving, her hesitation making me feel more isolated than ever. And yet, amidst the shock, something inside me hardened. "Got it," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "Consider it's your last wish." The words surprised even me, carrying an edge of quiet defiance I didn't know I possessed. His eyes flicked at me, disbelief and rage warring for dominance, but I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. I had already decided. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be the one crumbling. My phone started buzzing incessantly in my pocket, notifications flashing across the screen like urgent alarms. Friends, distant relatives, even classmates were reaching out, confused, worried, messages of concern, some pleading, some angry, some just checking in, all piling up in a chaotic flood that I didn't have the energy to manage. I ignored them for the moment, letting the storm rage outside and inside, letting my hands shake just enough to remind me I was alive, I was real, I was done being someone else's pawn. I started packing, slowly, methodically, as if by organizing my belongings I could somehow put order to the chaos that had invaded my life. Clothes folded, books stacked, little mementos tucked away in a bag that smelled faintly of my favorite shampoo. Each item I touched was a small act of reclamation, a quiet protest against the injustice I had endured. For years, I had been careful, cautious, bending to the whims of a man who claimed authority but offered nothing in return but control. Tonight, that ended. And though the apartment felt emptier with each item packed, I sensed something else growing, an ember of strength, glowing in the corners of my chest where fear had once lived. As the night deepened, I paused by the window, looking out at the city lights that blurred together like distant stars. My heart pounded in rhythm with the buzzing phone at my side, and I realized with a clarity that was almost frightening. I wasn't running away because I was weak. I was leaving because I had decided to take control. The steps I would take next, the decisions I would make would be mine and mine alone. The last thing I did before leaving was glance back at the apartment that had been a battlefield disguised as a home. I whispered, barely audible even to myself, "Consider it your last wish." And with that, I stepped out into the night, the cool air biting my skin, carrying with it the first taste of freedom, and the faint promise that one day I would make him remember that choice. The plane landed just before dawn, the sky outside the window a dull gray that felt heavier than the suitcase in my hand. Russia wasn't a dream or an escape. It was a sentence handed down by someone who thought distance meant erasure. As I stepped into the cold air, it cut through my coat and into my lungs, sharp and unforgiving, as if the country itself was testing whether I deserved to be here. I welcomed it. Pain, at least, was honest. The first days passed in silence. I stayed in a small rented room with peeling paint and a heater that clicked like it was arguing with itself. Every night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the slap in my mind. Not just the sound of it, but the certainty behind it. The way he believed he could end me with a sentence. The way my mother's silence echoed louder than his words. I stopped answering messages, not because I didn't care, but because I needed the quiet to think, to rebuild myself without anyone else's voice telling me who I was supposed to be. Eventually, I began to move. I learned the streets, the rhythm of the city, the way people kept their emotions guarded but their eyes observant. I found work that didn't ask too many questions and paid just enough to survive. Each small success felt like a brick laid in a new foundation, one he could never touch. I started writing things down, dates, memories, things he had said, promises he had broken. Not out of obsession, but out of clarity. I wanted the truth preserved, untouched by time or guilt. At night, curiosity crept in. I checked my phone, scrolling through social media with careful distance, like looking at a wound without pressing on it. His life was still there, intact on the surface. Smiling photos, proud captions, the performance of a man who believed he had won. But cracks were visible if you knew where to look. Complaints disguised as jokes, subtle signs of strain. I watched without reacting, learning patience the hard way. The messages from him came late, weeks after I had arrived. Short at first, cold, demanding updates, control, reassurance that I was still where he had sent me. I didn't respond. Silence became my shield, my first act of resistance. Each unanswered message shifted the balance, even if he didn't realize it yet. Control only works when someone agrees to be controlled. As time passed, my anger changed shape. It no longer burned hot and reckless. It settled into something colder, sharper. I wasn't plotting harm. I didn't want to become him. What I wanted was truth to stand in the open, undeniable, unignorable. I wanted him to face the version of himself he had tried so hard to bury under authority and fear. I built connections slowly, carefully, people who knew people, stories shared over coffee, offhand remarks that confirmed what I had long suspected, that his behavior wasn't a secret, just something everyone pretended not to see. I listened more than I spoke. Information came easily when you didn't rush it. One night, as snow tapped softly against the window, my phone buzzed again. His name lit up the screen, followed by a message that read, "Answer me. This isn't funny." I stared at it for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. For the first time, I smiled, not because I felt victorious, but because I felt free. He thought sending me away had ended the story. What he didn't understand was that distance had given me something I'd never had before: perspective, and with it, the patience to wait. Whatever came next wouldn't be loud or cruel. It would be quiet, precise. And when it finally reached him, he would know, without a doubt, that exile had been his greatest mistake. The weeks in Russia stretched into months, and with each passing day I felt myself shifting. The anger that had once burned like wildfire had cooled into something more precise, a steady current, pulling me toward a goal I refused to name aloud. I had no illusions about revenge being simple or immediate. If it was to be real, it had to be surgical, elegant, undeniable. No outbursts, no chaos, just the quiet undoing of someone who had believed he was untouchable. I started small. Nothing illegal. Nothing that could be called criminal. Just subtle maneuvers that exposed cracks he had worked so hard to hide. I found mutual contacts, people whose lives had intersected with his in ways I could quietly track. Social media became my map, emails my compass. Every misstep he made, every boast he shared, every careless word he sent into the digital wind became another piece of evidence. I didn't respond, didn't confront, just observed. Patience was a weapon, and I wielded it with care. I remember the day I saw it, the first true ripple of effect. A mutual acquaintance had casually mentioned his arrogance at work, how he had taken credit for someone else's project, how his hubris had made him enemies where he thought he had loyalty. I smiled to myself, quiet satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. I sent a single, carefully crafted message from an anonymous account, planting seeds of doubt, clarifying details he had tried to hide. By the end of the week, whispers had spread. He had to answer questions he hadn't expected, to defend himself in ways he wasn't prepared for. Each victory was small but intoxicating. I began cataloging them, writing notes to myself as though chronicling the rise of a story I had authored from afar. There was no malice in my process, only clarity. The man who had sent me away, who had believed he could erase me with a slap and a command, was slowly, invisibly unraveling. At night, I allowed myself to relive the moments that had sparked this path. The slap, the words, the look in his eyes. I didn't let the memories consume me. Instead, I let them sharpen my resolve. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing he would never see it coming. He thought he had closed the door, cut the cord. In reality, he had opened a window through which I could watch, learn, and plan. Friends in Russia became unwitting allies. Casual conversations revealed the kinds of missteps he couldn't cover up, the details of his public image versus his private behavior. I learned how to manipulate perception without touching a thing. The brilliance of it was in its subtlety. Each revelation was a mirror held up to him, a reflection of the arrogance and cruelty he had believed were hidden. Then came the messages, out of nowhere, out of timing, desperate and pleading. "Why are you ignoring me? This isn't funny. I need to hear your voice." I left them unread, letting them fester, each one a testament to the imbalance shifting between us. The more he tried to reclaim control, the more evident it became that he had lost it long before he even realized. And still, I didn't act openly. I didn't need to. His reputation began to crumble quietly but unmistakably. People started questioning him, questioning his competence, his integrity. Friends and colleagues who had once nodded at his arrogance now whispered about his mistakes, wondering if the man they knew had always been more fragile than he let on. I sat in my small apartment one evening, snow falling softly against the window, and allowed myself a long, slow exhale. For the first time, I realized the truth. Revenge wasn't about screaming, striking, or showing anger. It was about watching someone dismantle themselves while you remained whole. Every silent victory, every unnoticed ripple, was proof that I had the power he had tried so desperately to steal from me. And when the time came for the final move, it would not be a tempest. It would be inevitable. He would see it all too late, and there would be nothing he could do. This was no longer about him slapping me or sending me away. It was about me reclaiming everything he thought he could take. And the quiet satisfaction in that knowledge was sweeter than any anger I had ever felt. The day I finally returned was nothing like I had imagined in my dreams. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting matches or tears in the street. Instead, I stepped off the plane with calm in my chest and a plan fully formed, knowing that the final move would speak louder than any argument ever could. Months of preparation, patience, and quiet observation had led to this moment. I was no longer the person who had been slapped and sent away. I was someone he had underestimated, someone he would never forget. I let the first few days pass slowly, watching from a distance as the subtle consequences of my absence continued to unfold. His colleagues had begun to question his judgment. Friends had started noticing inconsistencies in his stories, and even family members were hinting at frustrations they had long hidden. The man who had tried to erase me had inadvertently allowed me to rewrite the narrative of his life. Every careless action, every arrogant word he had spoken, was now being reflected back at him, and I had orchestrated it all without stepping into the spotlight. Finally, the time came for the message that would finish the work. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't threaten. I simply sent a carefully composed email, addressed to everyone who mattered in his life, laying out the facts he had ignored and the mistakes he had made. Nothing false, nothing exaggerated, just clarity. Every lie he had spun, every boast he had made at the expense of others, was presented calmly, logically, and in a way that could not be dismissed. I waited, and then I watched. It didn't take long for the reactions to start. Replies poured in, questioning him, demanding explanations, retracting trust he had long assumed was untouchable. His voice on the phone, when I finally answered one of his desperate calls, was unsteady, uncertain. Why? Why are you doing this? He asked, a hint of fear creeping through his arrogance. I smiled quietly, letting the silence stretch before speaking. Because I needed you to understand, I said softly. All the power you thought you had over me? Gone. All the control you believed was yours? Gone. And now you're seeing the consequences of your actions, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because this is what happens when you try to erase someone who refuses to disappear. He had no words. For once, the arrogance and control that had defined him were stripped away, leaving only the man who had underestimated the person he thought he could dismiss. And in that silence, I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. Not joy in revenge, not triumph in humiliation, but quiet, steady peace in knowing I had reclaimed my story. I left the phone on the table and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. The city hummed around me, indifferent to past dramas and private battles, and I realized that I didn't need his acknowledgement or approval. I had built a life in my absence, grown stronger in solitude, and learned the value of patience and precision. What he felt now, the discomfort of seeing his own misdeeds reflected back at him, was simply a mirror. It was not my anger, it was my freedom speaking. By the evening, I was home in my own mind, if not the house I had left. Friends reached out, not with fear or confusion, but with relief and warmth. I responded on my own terms, fully present in the life I had rebuilt. The stepdad, meanwhile, remained trapped in a web of his own making, a living testament to the consequences of cruelty and arrogance. I smiled as I watched him fumble through messages, emails, and inquiries, powerless to fix what he had broken. I had not struck him, I had not shouted, I had not acted recklessly. I had simply endured, observed, and let time reveal the truth. And in the end, that was far more satisfying than any immediate revenge could have been. As the sun set, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, I whispered to myself, "Consider it your last wish." This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise kept, a story reclaimed, and a life finally free.